session 4. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic is having a severe impact on economies and social well-being of people around the globe. Thus, timely social protection support is critically important to minimize the economic impact of the pandemic on affected individuals. At the core of developing and implementing programs to counter the adverse effects of the pandemic are mechanisms to effectively target the poor and vulnerable groups of the population. And this session has been organized to discuss approaches for targeting those that need assistance most. For this session, we have two colleagues who have kindly agreed to share their thoughts and experiences on the topic. So first, we have Amir Hamza Jilani, who will be speaking about how can governments identify and reach the poor in the wake of COVID-19. Second, we have Elizabeth Burgess Sims, who will talk about the hidden pandemic, addressing the differential impacts of COVID-19 on women, men, and other vulnerable groups in Southeast Asia. Before we hear from our presenters, I would like to request you to answer the poll questions for this session. So let's do this for a couple of minutes. The link is shown in your screen. Can you see the questions? Hannah?
Sir, the link is in the chat box.
Oh, okay. So please, answer them and make sure that you choose the answers and click the submit button. Just two questions. Okay, so let's now move on to the presentations. So each presenter will have 15 minutes. After the two presentations, we will have 20 minutes for open discussions. So without much ado, please welcome Amir to deliver the first presentation. Amir, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'll just wait for my presentation to come up on the screen. Great. Okay, excellent. So thanks again, Joel, and Bernard for inviting me to participate in this really timely workshop and panel discussion on COVID-19 impacts and control measures. My presentation today attempts to provide a set of options and guiding principles really on how governments can identify and reach the poor in the wake of COVID-19, specifically with the aim of casting wider safety nets and expanding coverage of social protection programs. Let me just state at the outset that there is no perfect approach to targeting and delivering assistance. There wasn't one pre-COVID, and there certainly isn't one on which there is universal consensus developing during the current crisis. Some are better than others, some simply aren't viable options for every country, but each come with their own set of risks and challenges, most noteworthy amongst which is excluding potentially vulnerable households. And so what I'll do in this presentation is briefly discuss the different options available to policymakers, highlight their relative strengths and weaknesses, and outline which groups of the population they can reach, and also try and provide some examples of countries that have leveraged one or more of these options effectively, and provide some key takeaways that I hope will be useful. Next slide. So this slide very quickly just provides a visual snapshot of the poverty impacts of COVID-19, And as you can see, the region would have seen a steady decline in the number of poor in the absence of COVID-19, in line with much of the experience over the past few decades. But with COVID-induced economic disruptions and lockdowns, there is now a jump in extreme poverty. So instead of 114 million people living in extreme poverty in 2020, there are now an estimated 192 million, or an additional 78 million people expected to live on less than $1.90 a day in our part of the world. So this is really representing the first global rise in extreme poverty since 1998. But of course, there are an additional 162 million people who will be living on less than $3.20 a day, and so of course remain extremely vulnerable. So how do you identify these poor and vulnerable households for social protection during COVID-19? Next slide. Well, there are numerous options for expanding social protection coverage, and they vary in their degree of sophistication and efficiency. But I'm going to talk about four in this presentation that I think are promising and being used right now or could be used moving forward. The first, of course, is utilizing existing data from the social protection sector, namely data from socioeconomic registries, pension databases, and beneficiary lists from existing programs. And so many countries had already been collecting data on households to populate their social registries in recent years, but there's been quite a bit of heterogeneity in terms of coverage, ranging from 30% of the population in some countries to 90% in others. So recognizing the inherently difficult task of identifying the poor in the first place, the second strategy looks to use existing government data beyond the social protection sector. And this includes leveraging data from ID systems, civil registration and vital statistics data, or CRVS, tax, vehicle, and land ownership data to open up a range of options all the way from applying a universal approach to delivering assistance to one that excludes the rich and somewhat better off, something known as affluence testing, which has been used across the UK, Canada, South Africa, and Mongolia. And because it is often much easier to identify the rich and the better off, you immediately know who to exclude or target out from receiving assistance. The third option, which I think is quite promising, draws on data outside the government, partnering with telecom operators, financial inclusion programs, informal worker organizations, and others to obtain more granular and potentially real-time data to estimate who is likely to be poor. And I'll explain a little later what kind of rich information this option can provide. And finally, because relying exclusively on existing data, whether from the government or outside, may not recognize the dynamic nature of poverty, the fourth option aims to allow the poor to self-identify and register themselves through digital windows, SMS, helplines, and whenever safe, in-person registration centers. So we can now dig a little deeper into the merits and key considerations of each of these options. Next slide, please. Okay, so the main advantage of option one, or using existing data from the social protection sector and recently updated socioeconomic registries, is that they can be easily used to scale up programs, both horizontally by adding new beneficiaries, as well as vertically by increasing benefit amounts to existing beneficiaries. And because data on household IDs, mobile phone numbers, and payment information can be easily obtained, disbursement can be very quick and efficient without requiring the need for long and potentially costly registration drives, which are particularly risky during the current crisis. Of course, the challenge is that social registries may not have universal coverage on the socioeconomic status of every household, and they can quickly become out of date, excluding potentially vulnerable households who have been disproportionately affected by very recent shocks. And so given the fluid nature of poverty, these registries have to be routinely updated and used in conjunction with other sources of data on vulnerability. One important consideration when using existing data is that countries should have reasonable confidence in the completeness, quality, and currency of the data. In terms of coverage, which you can see on the right-hand side, this option generally tends to do a better job capturing those at the bottom end of the income distribution, since they're often the target beneficiaries of most means-tested social assistance programs, as well as somewhat better off households who are part of pension databases. Importantly, this option doesn't perform as well when it comes to enrolling informal sector workers. Next slide, please. So given the challenges of relying primarily on data from the social protection sector, including outdated socioeconomic registries, governments can tap into a broader repository of data outside the sector. And this includes using ID and civil registration and vital statistics data if governments want to apply a more universal approach to coverage, or use income tax files, bank records, property registration, vehicle ownership, and overseas travel history if they want to target out the rich and better off and then deem everyone else eligible, often known as affluence testing. Now, this particular option can be particularly helpful for reaching those not covered by either social assistance or social insurance programs, namely the missing middle and informal workers. So Morocco, for example, reached 3 million informal workers during the crisis by tapping into existing health sector databases. And then they cross-checked with civil registry, social security, and other administrative databases to ensure that they managed to enroll informal sector workers. On the other hand, there are inevitable fiscal and budgetary implications for low-income countries when they apply a more universal approach to targeting, similar to what we saw in Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, and a few other advanced economies do during the immediate crisis period with their one-off cash transfers. And while this approach can potentially extend coverage to households across the income distribution, it does require building on a strong foundation of ID systems and civil registries. Something that we know in many economies in our region, these systems are often underdeveloped and not all individuals have access to IDs, cell phones, and bank accounts. Next slide, please. Okay, so a third option looks outside of government databases and offers opportunities to use new forms of data in very creative ways. We know that one of the challenges governments face is identifying new vulnerable populations, particularly those in the informal sector and recent migrant returnees. Evidence from Bangladesh suggests that communities with recent migrant returnees are 2.5 times more likely to report COVID-like symptoms. And really, this is across many DMCs in our region where migrants and urban informal workers are living in crowded informal settlements where conditions are ripe for the transmission of disease, and workers are moving around in search of alternative livelihoods. So, how do you make some of these communities less desperate to move around and seek alternative livelihoods to remain afloat? Well, one technology that people do carry around in their pockets, which is near universal in places like Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, Philippines, and others, is mobile phones. And the advantage, of course, of this technology and the data that you can obtain from it is that it is far more dynamic and updated in near real time. And so we can start to analyze how the consumption and spending patterns of the poor differ from the non-poor and answer questions about who is likely to be hurting more right now. And with anonymization, cross-validation, and advanced algorithms, you can start developing a system for better identifying who the poor are, where they're located, and how to deliver assistance to them most effectively. So I'll give you an example of the kind of data that telecom providers have access to and what this could mean in terms of targeting. Next. Okay. So network operators know what phones we're using, the make, the brand, how frequently it has changed, which obviously can be used as one proxy for income. They also have detailed transaction and expenditure data, including top-up amounts that can offer insights into consumer spending pre and post-crisis. As well as use of services and apps that provide an indication of basic education and literacy. So Pakistan, for example, used average monthly expenditure over the last 6 months as one data point to complement a number of other wealth proxies to target and identify the poor as part of its emergency cash transfer project. Bangladesh is working with researchers at Yale to leverage big data from telecom operators and machine learning to help predict who the poor are. And similarly, in Africa and Zimbabwe is considering using anonymized mobile phone data for geographic targeting after finding a strong correlation between population and mobile phone density and poverty rates in the capital. And if you have high mobile phone penetration and e-wallet penetration, it makes it possible to make payments directly to target beneficiaries. Next. So this is certainly a much faster and potentially more efficient way of identifying households than traditional targeting service approaches, which require deploying large teams to undertake household surveys. But there's also potentially rich information on vulnerable populations held by other non-government organizations, including self-help groups, local cooperatives, humanitarian organizations, and informal worker organizations that governments can try and tap into in order to reach specific communities. And these organizations can can also help deliver vital information on behalf of the central government, as well as share information on groups who have become recently vulnerable. There are, of course, I'm sure you're already imagining, certain risks, including potential privacy, data protection, and security concerns of using data from the private sector. Some of these, I think, can be overcome by introducing guidelines and checks and balances that you can embed in your data collection efforts to ensure that no agency has more information than it needs, and that you have the minimum amount of anonymized information you need to target effectively. But I also think we can't leave it up to a model or a machine to make all the decisions for us. There can be inclusion and exclusion errors if we leave out the human touch altogether. I think what machines can do is tell us who has a very high, medium, and low likelihood of being poor and vulnerable, and then we can use this information to cross-check with other databases for targeting assistance. Similarly, using data from local organizations and structures requires a degree of trust and confidence in the quality of that data and some track record of the organizations providing it. Next. Okay, so the final option in a policymaker's toolkit to identify vulnerable populations is setting up on-demand registration via digital windows, SMS, helplines, and there's been a significant rise in digital on-demand registration that we've observed across countries, with many countries simplifying processes, relaxing eligibility, and running extensive information campaigns to inform the public of emergency support programs. The countries that have followed these approaches usually build on a strong foundation of ID systems, but the major advantage of on-demand registration is that it recognizes that poverty is dynamic and fluid, and that people can in fact become poor overnight. So relying only on an applicant or beneficiary list prior to the crisis may exclude many vulnerable households. Of course, these aren't always easy to set up and often require substantial capacity and resources to deal with the large number of applications. They also require the poor to self-identify themselves through digital platforms, which may exclude vulnerable households without access to these technologies or ID systems. And so this is why there's a need for additional measures to often support information, outreach, and communication, particularly to reach those who may have issues accessing the digital window. But these platforms have been used using mobile phones and computers in countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Pakistan, and several parts of Latin America as well. Next. So my final slide, I'm just providing some key takeaways. I think the good news is that these options are not mutually exclusive. You don't need to fundamentally shift away from traditional approaches towards advanced technology, big data, and digital windows, because not everyone has access to a mobile phone. Many don't understand mobile wallets. More men tend to have mobile phones than women. AI technologies may not always get it perfectly. But you do really need to leverage the full extent of tools at your disposal and not be afraid of what technology and data from alternative sources can offer as a complement to traditional approaches for targeting and expanding social protection. So this might mean combining the traditional with the high-tech data analytics and the human touch and verification to triangulate different sources of information and deliver assistance to all those in need. I think the other lesson is that this crisis can also be used as an opportunity to really build momentum and strengthen collaboration across the public, private, and nonprofit sector. We're seeing new sources of collaboration already, but I think it's in the interest of everyone that people are not left behind and that economies can get back up and running. Similarly, the importance of effective outreach and communication, including a national circular providing key information on what households are eligible for, how they can access their benefits easily, and over what time period. This really can't be understated. Pakistan's SMS campaign is a really promising example of how to undertake a national communication campaign and attempt to remotely register vulnerable households. And finally, the choice of which option or combination of approaches to use should really be driven by local context, including what is and isn't readily available to governments. COVID has demonstrated that countries with more advanced social protection systems were in a much stronger position to respond quickly and efficiently to deliver timely and predictable support to vulnerable populations. And so as economies move into the transition and recovery period of the current crisis, It will be important to begin investing in shock responsive social protection systems that allow better identification, registration, enrollment of payment of benefits to all vulnerable groups, and particularly those in the informal sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Amir. As I mentioned earlier, we will have a Q&A after the two presentations. But if you have questions or comments, please type them in the chat box or write it down and raise them later. So at this point, allow me to welcome Elizabeth. Liz, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, distinguished colleagues. I'll wait for the presentation to come up, but I would like to thank you in advance for the opportunity to discuss one of the region's most challenging and multidimensional and cross-sectoral issues. To minimize any possibility of connection issues, I'll turn my camera on for the Q&A session, but I'll leave it for the presentation. Next slide, please. My objective is to offer an overview of the differential impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic upon women and other vulnerable groups in the region, explore SERD's programming responses to date, and the lessons learned thus far to inform our programming approaches in the future. I concur with Amir's assessment that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to ensuring effective gender mainstreaming through the COVID-19 responses. So what I'm about to present will need to be adapted and somewhat flexible based on the country needs. Next slide, please. COVID-19 has increased the risks of compounded discrimination, where the intersections of attributions and vulnerabilities worsen the impacts of the crisis upon individuals based on sex, age, disability, literacy, sexual orientation and gender identity, socioeconomic status, rural and urban realities, ethnicity, linguistic profiles, and so on. We gain insight into compounded discrimination by asking ourselves, who is engaged in leadership and decision making? How is information being disseminated and accessed, and by whom? Who has lost their incomes and our livelihoods? Who assumes the unpaid care role in the household? How are we ensuring health and well-being for all? How are resources being reallocated by decision makers and why? And who remains hidden, vulnerable, and unaccounted? The COVID-19 literature refers to this as the hidden pandemic, where groups of individuals are experiencing heightened levels of abuse, psychological, physical, sexual, and economic. Next slide, please. Women and girls, people with disabilities, ethnic minorities, and other vulnerable groups are largely absent from COVID-19 decision-making bodies in the region. For example, in Cambodia, the national mechanisms for guiding COVID response include 27 members, 2 of whom are women. In Laos, the 11-person committee includes 2 women, and in Vietnam, 4 of 22 are women. Next slide, please. Access to information on COVID-19 requires both availability of and capacity to understand the information that is being shared. IEC campaigns are rarely delivered in multiple languages. In Myanmar, for example, awareness-raising sessions and materials are only available in Burmese and English. In Indonesia, communities have expressed lack of language clarity on IEC messaging. IEC campaigns do not necessarily target people with sight or hearing impairments. For example, in Timor-Leste, there are no government requirements to make public information accessible to people with disabilities. And the digital gender divide is growing in Asia Pacific with severe consequences for access to information, participation, and benefits from socioeconomic development activities for the most vulnerable groups. Women and girls in Timor-Leste and Indonesia have less access to public spaces and exposure to public information, regardless of its source. In Myanmar, women are 28% less likely to own cell phones. And in Cambodia, only 20% of all students have online access for learning during COVID-19. Next slide, please. Women are overrepresented in the sectors and jobs that have been hardest hit by COVID-19. 1.3 billion people, or 68.2% of employed people in Asia Pacific, are informal sector workers. 94% of women in Cambodia, 87% in Myanmar, and 37% in Thailand work in the informal sector. 75% of garment factory workers in the GMS region are women, where 75% in Vietnam, 50% in Myanmar, and 90% in Laos are either at risk of or have already lost their jobs, faced decreased hours, or less income since COVID. In Cambodia, women garment factory workers receive 81% of men's earnings for work of equal value. And 24.5 million women in the tourism sector in Southeast Asia are at risk of losing their jobs. In Philippines, women represent 49.2% of tourism workers. While these statistics are well known in the region, women in precarious employment are disproportionately vulnerable during COVID-19. Why? Because women in the informal sector, as daily wage laborers, as undocumented migrants, self-employed, or unpaid family labor, are unable to access social protection programs. Next slide, please. Women's unpaid care responsibilities have also increased exponentially during COVID-19. The lockdown and quarantine measures have increased pre-existing pressures on domestic chores, including cleaning, food preparation, water collection, and care of family members of all ages. Traditional gender norms around household decision-making have seen many countries issue quarantine passes to male heads of households, despite the traditional care roles. With school closures, women have assumed the lead as home-based educators for school-age children, regardless of their own literacy or numeracy capabilities. In the Philippines, women on average spend 3 more hours per day on housework since COVID-19. In Vietnam, employed women work on average 38.8 hours per week on paid jobs and 23.5 hours per week in the household, which is 1.2 hours less and 12.7 hours more than men, respectively. And in Thailand, migrant women work approximately 28 hours per week in unpaid tasks, 21 hours more than men. Next slide, please. In Southeast Asia, 80% of the nurses are women, with increasing representation of women among physicians and pharmacists. Women also predominate health facility roles as cleaners, laundry workers, caterers, and retail workers. Physical distancing, quarantines, and self-isolation may be impossible for people with disabilities and their caregivers. This has increased the risk of infection and abandonment should caregivers get sick. Disruptions in supply chains, mobility constraints, and fear of infection are affecting access to antiretroviral and other life-saving medications across the region. And quarantine centers, particularly those in the border zones, do not cater to women's needs nor offer safety from sexual exploitation and abuse, including of children. When you look at the stats on access to water and sanitation services, imagine the feeling of helplessness when public messaging tells people that proper hygiene and hand washing are key to stemming the spread of COVID-19, and then not being able to secure water for these needs. Next slide, please. Supply chain disruptions for contraceptives, diverted resources, mobility restrictions, limited public transportation, and fear of infection have affected women's pursuit of sexual and reproductive health care services during COVID-19. In Cambodia and Timor-Leste, maternal mortality continues to be a leading cause of death among women aged 15 to 49 years. In the Philippines, the UNFPA is forecasting a spike of 2.6 million unwanted pregnancies due to movement restrictions and diminished access to family planning services and supplies. In Indonesia, scarcity and the cost of menstrual hygiene supplies during COVID-19, coupled with inadequate access to sanitation facilities, have led to unhygienic practices and increased risks of infection among women and girls. Next slide, please. Income loss, increased care burdens, fear of illness, food and housing insecurity, heightened debt burdens, especially with loan sharks, confinement and isolation from support networks are causing a rise in mental health issues, including depression, anxiety, and negative coping strategies. In turn, these negative coping strategies have led to spikes in addictions, abuse, and violence. In Vietnam, 62.9% of women experienced one type of violence in their lifetime by a husband. In Timor-Leste, almost 1/3 of girls aged 15 to 19 reported experiencing sexual or other violence in the last 12 months. And in Thailand, 16% of women have experienced domestic violence, psychological, physical, economic, or sexual. Livelihood disruptions, food insecurity, and mobility restrictions may also lead to an increase in sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment as a means of survival, including early child and forced marriage, sex work, and human trafficking. And critically, resource reallocations within the health sector have affected funding channels to essential NGO and CSO gender-based violence service providers, influencing their capacities to respond. Next slide, please. SERD has partnered with our developing member countries to deliver gender responses to COVID-19 in the form of social protection, healthcare, livelihoods, and improved governance. Next slide, please. So this slide offers a snapshot of the projects that have been approved and 2 that are under development, including their gender categorizations. So this presentation will be shared with you later, so you'll be able to look these up again. Next slide, please. This slide demonstrates the social protection programming support by country, ranging from food security support that explicitly targets women to social security programs, cash transfers, and unemployment benefits that target women, children, informal sector, and migrant workers. Next slide, please. This slide demonstrates the health programming, ensuring that testing is available and medical expenses are covered for all, that healthcare workers are being compensated for the risks they are taking and are being protected by adequate and well-sized PPEs, that guidelines and protocols developed recognize the different needs of individuals, including pregnant women and victims of violence, and that quarantine facilities provide for the needs of women, men, and children. Next slide, please. And this slide demonstrates the economic stability and livelihood supports, ranging from supports to women-owned MSMEs, tax relief to MSMEs with a focus on women-dominated sectors, and tax relief and wage subsidies to female workers. One more slide. This demonstrates the public outreach, governance, and monitoring support, where national plans and policy dialogue address the differential needs of vulnerable groups. IEC campaigns and local community structures target the realities of different groups, and project commitments are tracked and disaggregated with disaggregated data, by gender consultants. Next slide, please. Now we turn to translating the knowledge we have gained into proactive and sustainable gender outcomes across the region. To do so, we need to understand how best to undertake a gender-based analysis despite COVID-19 restrictions, where our comparative advantage lies, and what is the best way forward for ADB support in the region. Next slide, please. Undertaking a gender-based situational analysis of our projects in this new environment of limited mobility and physical distancing is challenging. We need to go back to basics and consider the following. Has the project taken into consideration the needs of all the intended beneficiaries? And has COVID-19 changed these priorities? We need to consider our networks. Who are the CSOs and NGOs that are present in communities? What women's organizations are present and how do we involve them in the context of each individual project? As with all projects, we must ensure inclusive community outreach. In alignment with government COVID-19 regulations, we need to be creative in how we approach consultations. We need to work with local leaders and community groups, and we need to ensure that we take all potential compounding discrimination factors into account to ensure equitable and inclusive consultations. COVID-19 has offered a unique opportunity to build local businesses. We should be exploring hiring local skilled and unskilled labor and opportunities to procure project-related supplies from women-led micro and small enterprises. For example, locally produced PPEs, soap, food, signage, construction supplies, and so on. The opportunity to support local businesses extends even further into the logistics space. How might local supply chains and distributors support the efficient distribution of goods and services, including construction materials? Might there be a space to build new local partnerships and support the growth of this sector in our partner countries? Throughout the analysis, it is vital to ensure a continuous feedback loop to to be sure we know how the intended project beneficiaries perceive the support they are receiving. An important component here is an effective grievance redress mechanism to ensure the safety and responsiveness of our investments. In effect, this is the pulse check and our opportunity to adjust, realign, or validate as we implement. Next slide, please. Let's be bold. We should be designing IEC campaigns that spread new messages on equality and inclusion by unpacking gender-based stereotypes, unconscious bias, and other barriers to participation. We should be reinforcing the need to improve disaggregated data collection by sex, age, and ability. We should be challenging EAs and IAs to identify female leaders on projects at the institutional and community levels. We should be ensuring equitable access to information by considering potential barriers to dissemination and accessibility. We should be delivering gender sensitization, leadership, and other capacity building to unpack gender-based stereotypes and tackle unconscious bias. We should be developing on-the-job training and career pathways to build human capital by including women, people with disabilities, and ethnic minorities. We should be setting minimum quotas for women's participation in all outreach activities, consultations, focus groups, interviews, and surveys. And we should be holding EAs and IAs accountable for government commitments, both international and national, to conventions, laws, policies, and strategies that seek to advance equality and inclusion. Next slide, please. We need to think big to stimulate inclusive human capital development. Women's formal labor force participation rates range from 46% in Myanmar to 81.4% in Cambodia. Imagine the economic growth potential of a Southeast Asia with an inclusive, skilled, and productively employed population. We should be committing to IEC messaging that unpacks the social norms and behaviors that disproportionately burden women and girls with unpaid care responsibilities. Changing behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs takes time. We should be supporting policy-level commitments and actions that level the playing field in the labor market. We should be setting ambitious employment targets for women, people with disabilities, and ethnic minorities. We should be incorporating proactive project activities to stimulate local employment, training, and certification. We should be targeting women-owned, homegrown businesses that adopt an inclusive business philosophy. We should be exploring innovative, alternative financing options to improve the competitiveness of marginalized micro and small enterprises. And we should be considering local sourcing and building local supply chains that with project procurement activities. Next slide, please. The reality is quite simple. Healthy people equal healthy communities equal healthy countries. We should be leading by example. COVID-19 has identified gaps in the region's surface. We should be ensuring safe and secure drinking water and sanitation facilities in public spaces and at home, ensuring reliable and balanced supplies of nutritious foods for the whole family, ensuring reliable sexual and reproductive health products and services, including menstrual hygiene, family planning, labor, and delivery, ensuring that healthcare services do not discriminate and offer physical and mental health services to all, including sex workers, migrant workers, individuals with HIV/AIDS, and victims of violence. And we need to ensure access to affordable technology and transportation that can enable full participation in decision-making at all levels, regardless of sex, age, or ability. But most of all, we should ensure that lives are free from abuse and violence in all of its forms, psychological, physical, economic, and sexual, and that individuals are able to participate fully in socioeconomic growth. Next slide, please. UN OPS projects a 97 trillion financing need for global infrastructure investment by 2040. 2/3 of this investment will be required in developing countries. It is time. Moving forward, ADB and our partners should be launching mass outreach campaigns to unpack gender-based stereotypes and secure the enrollment of women and girls in skills training and certification programs that enhance resilience and preempt the livelihood impacts of unforeseen disasters and/or pandemics. We should be shifting away from gender-blind investments and moving towards planning for the different needs of male and female beneficiaries of all ages and abilities, while designing, procuring, structuring, building, and employing in a way that is both responsive and inclusive. And we should be investing in gender-responsive public and social infrastructure, including water, sanitation, clean energy, transportation, and care services to lead recovery and build resilience. Now is the time to renew our collective focus on gender-responsive best practices that build human capital and create long-term, equitable, and sustainable growth and employment. ADB is well positioned to support our developing member countries to achieve growth and prosperity that bypasses compounded discrimination and advances equitable and inclusive development outcomes for all. And final slide. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Liz. Before we go to the Q&A, allow me to show you the results of the poll questions. Anna, please. Are you able to see the results of the poll?
Please be patient. We are slowly counting. Every vote counts.
No protest, I hope.
No, yeah, and I hope nobody tried to vote twice either. No court challenges will be accepted.
You will be the Supreme Court.
Oh, okay. We got the results.
Okay, so which of the following is most effective in identifying and reaching the poor in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic? So I guess if you listen closely to Amir's presentation, it's a combination of the four options that he has outlined, no? And this would be also in consideration of the local context. On second question, which of the following DMCs have the most number of gender mainstreaming interventions in COVID-19 social protection programming? Again, I think Liz has discussed this, and the answer should be what, Liz? Is it Philippines?
Correct. It's the Philippines with Indonesia and a very close second. I would actually probably combine those two as first.
Okay, so let's go to Q&A. So I received a message from Dulce that the presenters, including myself, should switch on the videos, and there will be some picture. Okay, Amir, Liz, please. Okay. Okay, questions. We have one from Sonomi, addressed to Liz. There is a little gendered COVID impact data. What are SERD plans for gender data collection, such as surveys, working with UN women, etc.? Liz, you're on mute.
Thank you. Agreed, there is limited data across the region on many gender issues, so this is a bigger problem than just COVID-19 and an area we should be working on into the future. But just to say that there are a number of organizations, so UN Women, UNFPA, CARE International have undertaken a number of COVID rapid assessments across the region. So there is some data that we can pull from, but certainly it's an area that we would like to work on individual countries with, as I put in the chat box. So I'm happy to talk more, Sonomi, about how we can do that in Lao.
Any questions from the group? Anyone, please? Okay, Alfredo, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for the excellent presentations. I have a question for Amir in terms of targeting for social protection. Some people argue that actually the whole idea of targeting is not something that we should pursue, and having a more universal way of social protection actually should be more effective. The reason being that targeting, I mean, there's mistargeting in both directions. Either targeting, of course, people that don't deserve to be targeted, and we are missing also a lot of people that we should target, and that is a very expensive process, or it could be very expensive. So you offer a range of possibilities for doing so, but you didn't refer to the cost of those in terms of advantages and disadvantages. I wonder if there is some studies or experience that identify which is the most cost-effective ways to do so, and if could you still argue or demonstrate that actually targeting is in fact something worth to do, or it depends maybe on the program.
Yeah, Alfredo, that's a very good question. Thank you. So, you know, cost effectiveness also actually depends a little bit on context, because countries that already have invested in socioeconomic registries, for them, using those registries to either relax the eligibility criteria, enrolling previously rejected applicants or those on waiting lists, as well as past beneficiaries, is one of the easiest and perhaps most cost-effective ways of enrolling new households. The challenge, of course, is that it's based on data collected often prior to the crisis, and so in the process, you may not end up capturing new vulnerable households. With regards to universal social protection, of course, the major advantage is that you get to avoid timely, those costly, registration drives and are able to deliver benefits to everyone. But there are major fiscal budgetary implications. And so the question to policymakers is, do we want to provide more with less, or provide less with more? And I don't think that there is a consensus on that just yet. The few universal basic income evaluations that have been done haven't found the sort of resounding positive results across every outcome. And so this is still an area that I think we're actually learning quite a bit in real time. And I think over the course of in the coming months, we'll actually learn a little bit more about the cost effectiveness of these various options as well. Thanks.
Dulce, you have a question?
Thanks, Joel. Thanks, Liz and Amir. Okay, my question is, I think more for Amir. A big part of the informal sector are women. However, Amir mentioned that men tend to have mobile phones than women. So I was just thinking, would it be then a good project for the government, to consider providing, inexpensive mobile phones to these women in the hope of capturing them, putting them in a registry, and then to cover them eventually under different social protection programs? Thank you.
Thank you, Dulce. Great, that was a really good question. I think you're absolutely right. Without the simultaneous investments in digital technologies, mobile phones coverage, and trying to bridge the digital divide as well as the financial inclusion divide between men and women, many social protection programs won't be able to realize their full potential. And so it's very important for us to understand the key constraints that make it harder for women to access digital technologies, mobile phones, ID systems, and think about targeted programs to bridge some of those gaps. And I think that some of the options that I mentioned for identifying vulnerable households really rely on the assumption that these households have access to ID systems or mobile phones. And so I do know that there's quite a bit of work going on in this space, but it's an area where governments can really try and create a space that encourages collaboration across the public, private, and nonprofit sector. Thanks.
Lisa, I suppose you have some. Go ahead.
Yes, if I may add to that, there is an international movement underway right now to look at access to mobile phones, and in particular smartphones, as a basic human right, given the access to technology needs that now proliferate as soon as you have a smartphone in your hand. This is particularly relevant as well while we see the region relying on online education in so many spaces. So I think we will see this pressure pick up, and I strongly encourage we look at innovative ways to build it into our programming. Thank you for the question.
Liz, I think there's a question directed to you from David. I'll read it out. We are constantly hearing about a green recovery, but there is less discussion of gender dimensions of the post-COVID recovery. What is the biggest opportunity for policymakers in Southeast Asia to accelerate recovery while addressing underlying inequalities?
So first, I think the reason that there's less attention being focused on dialogue around gender issues in the recovery process is there is an assumption that by focusing on recovery, we are de facto targeting men and women because they are all suffering. And so this is an area, this is why we need the information campaigns and the training, particularly with decision makers and leadership, on the differential impacts of COVID upon men and women. But certainly there are opportunities. In my opinion, the biggest opening right now is addressing human capital development. Frankly, if we have 50% or less of our population productively employed, you can't really expect to see significant impacts on poverty reduction at the household level. So how can we find productive employment? How can we secure training, short course training, upskilling opportunities, local business support to build formal sector employment across the region and have the small businesses that we know proliferate in the informal sector contribute actively to the economic recovery. And that's where we're going to target women, because that is where their employment is largely based.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Hello, can you hear me? This is Cleo.
Hi, Cleo. Yes, please go ahead.
Hey, Liz. Hi, Mimir. Presentation was great. I really enjoyed learning so much in such a short time. I was wondering, Liz, for the gender interventions and the recommendations of incorporating into projects, I mean, have we thought about the cost implications and, so that we can consider these and with government on cost basis? Because, for something that's going to cost, what, 250,000, we may be able to get a grant somewhere. But if it's much more costly, then we will have to get the money from the loan. So just wondering on the ranges and, you know, how we can create a menu and whether that work has already been done. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the $1 million question, quite literally. I think that one of the challenges that we've always had in terms of addressing and advancing gender equality through our programming is making our partners understand that actually it's not expensive. Much of the time we're doing the activities, we're just not targeting any specific groups. So for example, in consultations, we do consult widely, but do we make sure that we're consulting women, people with disabilities, and other vulnerable groups? So it's a question of back and looking at what are we doing and how can we build gender sensitization actions into that. They typically are not that expensive. Now, as we move forward with new projects, certainly we would like to see that there are both human and financial resources allocated, particularly with the new OP2 pressures to deliver higher gender equality results and outcomes. We do need to see budgetary allocations, and for that to happen, the conversation needs to involve the gender specialist team with the EAs and the IAs as early on in the process as possible. Projects that are already operational, again, bring in the gender team so we can sit down, we can understand the hesitation or the support that exists from the EA and the IA, and we can work with them to find those entry points and shift resources around. But typically where we are doing social programming, where we are considering the people, the beneficiaries, there is money and there is possibility to reorient to make sure that we're getting the maximum gender impact from the investment. Does that answer your question?
I want a menu.
All right, I'll work on the menu and I'll get back to you.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. I think there is a comment from Claire. I don't know if there's a question that you'd like to, Liz to comment on.
Yeah, I think Claire's point is a really good point actually to bring into the conversation here, in that the Philippines, among other countries, have committed to a percentage. So in the Philippines, it's 5 to 30% of its ODA funds need to address gender issues. Other countries have these commitments too. But often when you get down to, if the EA is a line ministry or the IA is, they sometimes don't know or understand these commitments. And so we need to be able to bring those out to them and say, no, actually, you know, this is a high level commitment that's been made. And so now let's look at the existing project activities and how we can adjust these to also hit this target. So again, it's an information dissemination piece. It's a training and capacity building piece. And we need to have gender specialists on board to help support that.
Thank you. I think we're almost, our time is almost up. So let me just summarize a few. Okay, yes, Claire, please go ahead. Yeah.
You know, ever since I come to SERD, I've been asking all of the country directors and sector directors whether it would be good to have a countrywide gender assessment before we go into the CPS process, to have some gender targets that aligned with the government's targets to put into the CPS. I'm just wondering, Rano, from a social protection aspect and from the gender aspect, if this would be something that would be useful. It's kind of like a gender roadmap that we would follow for each of our projects. I'll ask Amir first, and then Liz, if she can come in.
Thank you. I think that's a really great point. You know, we are seeing over the course of the last few months, taking a stock take and mapping the different responses by governments, is that many programs weren't necessarily designed to target women specifically or to understand the specific and unique constraints faced by women. And so I think an assessment to really understand what are the challenges women face in accessing social protection programs and how these programs can be delivered most effectively, whether that's by targeting transfers directly to women and the kind of technologies that may enable them to use and access social protection programs more effectively. I think that's really, really important because we know that women generally, as was mentioned earlier, have a lower adoption rate of mobile phone technologies, generally have lower access to ID systems, and so there's various gaps and constraints that need to be addressed if we want to make interventions looking to improve outcomes for women successful. So it's something that I think is a very good idea, whether it's part of a gender assessment prior to CPS or as part of project planning. I think it's really important to take into account those issues more carefully. Thanks.
I'm going to say something that's maybe a little controversial here, but we're all friends. So traditional country gender assessments are really long, lengthy analyses of the environment within a country, and they do serve a purpose without question. However, it can be extremely challenging to get an EA to spend time reviewing a 100+ page document on gender equality. And so my preference, and it's something that I've been speaking with the whole SERD gender team in all of our resident missions and country office, is the concept of doing sector diagnostics that would allow us to drill down within the ADB sectors and pull out the most salient information for our intended programming over the lifetime of the CPS, so that they're short and accessible and useful diagnostics. Now, one of the challenges, and Cleo, seeing as you opened up the door here, that we have is resourcing these activities. So we've been talking for a couple months now, actually, and we're looking at exploring both sector diagnostics in Indonesia and the Philippines, but what we need to resource them. So whether it's through my TA or country level TA, that is an issue. And then, but otherwise, I agree in principle. I just would like to see the documents very concise and useful so that we don't scare off our partners too much gender. So sorry if that's a little controversial.
No, too much gender. Okay. Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Amir. Back to you, Joe. Sorry for interrupting.
Okay, thank you. Just to summarize, the two presentations shared with us some pathways, options for targeting the poor and vulnerable in the wake of COVID-19. Amir has outlined 4 options, and he stressed that there is no single one best way for going forward, and he advises that the triangulation of these approaches or combination of these options would have to be considered, also the local context and capacities. Lisa's presentation underscored the daunting tasks that remain ahead as far as gender is concerned. I also noted a new aspect that needs to be looked into in her presentation, which is mental health. So I think that's a very important area to also consider going forward. Lisa's also underscored the importance of dialogue, communication, and stakeholder engagement. I think both presentations have also underscored the importance of data and information systems to aid decision making. Leadership is also important to really come up with the effective programs for targeting the poor and vulnerable. So we have come to the close of the presentation. I know the time is always not enough to cover all the grounds that we need to, cover. But allow me to thank Amir and Liz for excellent presentations and interactions with the participants. I would also like to thank the participants for your attention and inputs to the session. With that, we join the session, and I turn this over to Bernard.
Thank you very much, Joel. That was, great moderation, great presenting, and most importantly, active participation from our audience. So, and I think, earlier we were discussing how many people were turned out. People were standing outside the room. We had 60 over people, right? I think we reached a peak of 67. We had to open up extra chair outside, just giving the whatever the real world methodology. So thank you so much. So participants, we need one more thing from you. We have shared the feedback forms in the chat box. So I would appreciate for those who have attended the first day yesterday, they can also fill in the day 1 form. And for those who are here, of course, this morning, fill in the day 2 form. This will help us, get the feedback, see how useful it is. Very simple feedback, just a click. So, of course, as always, we will, of course, share the presentation. Actually, we are planning on creating some sort of a web page for the whole event so that everyone can see both the videos, not just the presentation, but your presentation will live on in posterity. You will be at least in ADB. So we plan to do that, and and of course we should always thank the people who also work very hard in the background. People like Dulce, Sheila, and Hannah. So please give them a big applause for ensuring everything went so smoothly this morning. So virtual applause. So thank you very much. Don't forget to fill in the form in the chat box, and don't forget to join us later this afternoon at 1:30. 2 more, how should we say, very informative sessions. One on how are we going to control COVID, and it's not just about buying the Pfizer vaccine, and also how we're going to use the big data. So I think Amir will be very excited to see the big data. Slightly different because we are looking at satellite technology for that part. So see you all at 1:30. Okay, be there. Thanks. Or be square, as they say. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.